David Tower, and welcome again to the Theories of Everything program. Viewers, in previous programs we've examined some of the big questions relating to human existence. We've examined the origins of the universe, forces that shape it. We've examined theories relating to the origins of life on this planet and perhaps on other planets in the universe, and how life's evolved and what its future prognosis might be. We've examined ideas relating to consciousness, the evolution of the mind, and what it might mean to have a global mind in the future connected by the internet. We've examined even theories relating to time, and we've interviewed Paul Davies on his ideas relating to a time machine. But in this program, viewers, we begin a new series, a series relating to the here and now in some sense, but also our total history in another, the human history relating to civilization. In this new series we'll be looking at the origins of civilization, the common features of different civilizations as they evolved in different parts of the world. We'll be going back in time to the very beginnings of the earliest human civilization, and we'll be going forward to this civilization now and what its future might be. So it involves everything around us, everything we've created, all our artefacts, all our knowledge, all our human structures. So it's a vast undertaking that we've achieved mainly in the last 10,000 years. So in this series we'll just be able to do a flyover, but what we'll be doing is looking for patterns. We'll be on a discovery process. We want to find out these common threads, to find out whether all empires, all nations have common features, how they interrelate, and what it means for our future. So viewers, to begin the Odyssey, we'll go right back to the beginnings of human history, right back to when early humans walked the planet. Viewers, the logical place to start our Odyssey is probably around 5 or 6 million years ago, when the first hominids split from primates, from chimpanzees. And in fact, we're still very close genetically to chimpanzees. In fact, a lot closer than chimpanzees are to other great apes. Perhaps that says something for chimpanzee rights, but basically there was a shift, there was mutations, the brain got a little larger, and they became more skillful, this early first group of humans, if you like, called Australopithecines today. But then we move forward a little. We don't know a lot about their culture, we don't know a lot about their early civilization, which must have been extremely basic, but we move forward a couple of million years to archaic humans, Homo erectus, who are much larger, brain size larger, around about 600 cubic centimetres, and they had skills, they had additional skills, and they were travellers because they began the first big migration out of Africa. They appear to have travelled first, in other words, walking the earth. Can you imagine it? The first colonisers, nothing to stop them really, just other large animals, and there were plenty of larger animals like saber-toothed tigers around that time. Even if the dinosaurs had long disappeared, it was a dangerous place. So they needed some weapons and some tools. They devised axes, they devised flints for cutting skin and meat and keeping themselves warm, because it was a very tough time. There were glacial periods, short interglacial periods when they could hunt more easily. But basically it was tough, so they had to arm themselves. And they appear to have started across the east first. There's fossil evidence of around 1.9, 1.8 million years in China, Central Asia, moving across to the Middle East about 1.5 million years ago, 1 million years ago in Europe. So they went that from the east to the west. They migrated, and that was quite a revolution. They were the first. That was the first big wave, and then around 500,000 years ago, another wave came out of Africa, known as Cro-Magnons. They colonised Europe. Also, their descendants, possibly Neanderthals, around about 250,000 years ago. And they developed those tools further. Their brains again were a little larger. They were a little more agile. They were able to develop the first body ornaments. And slightly more sophisticated tools. And the first art, there's evidence that there was some early art there, and very basic, simple sculptures. And then we progressed to the third migration. The third wave, of course, was Homo sapiens. Coming out of Africa again, another mutation, a very significant mutation. A series of mutations, whatever. The brain size had jumped. The brain size had jumped to around about 12 cubic centimetres. Much more cognitive ability, much greater ability for abstraction, just much as we have today. Again, the first, by about 50,000 years ago, they had colonised Europe. They had colonised Asia. They had moved down from Asia, through Asia, to in fact Australia by that stage. And their art shows up everywhere in the caves in France. Early paintings in Australia, in the Kimberleys, the Bradshaws. Mulberry juice was used. But they'd colonised the world and they'd almost wiped out, not necessarily by conflict, but just by superior numbers, superior cognitive qualities, planning, better strategies, etc. They had survived. The early Homo erectus apparently hadn't. So that again, by around 50,000 years ago, there was a huge surge in creative capability. Again, they had developed much more sophisticated tools. The early Homo erectus had developed rafts around 800,000 years ago. Cro-Magnons had developed spears. Wooden spears have been found dated around 400,000 years ago. But early humans, early Homo sapiens had developed tools for cutting and sewing, the early awls, the early cave art, and a whole lot of artefacts that began, in fact, the early civilization of humans. So viewers, we come to the first great revolution in civilization. The first great revolution was primed to happen because by now you've got the Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, virtually identical to us, same brain size, around 1200 cubic centimetres. New structures, neocortex for example, much greater cognitive analytical skills than the earlier humans and hominids. They were creative, they could paint, they could draw, they could create new types of artefacts, crafts, etc. But they needed something to drive them. They needed something to free them up, give them more time from their normal daily existence of hunting and gathering. And that something was the end of the great glacial age, the last great ice age, which had been running probably for around about at least 30,000 years. And it came to an end broadly around 15,000 years ago. And the great melt had begun in earnest. And this new proliferation of a wonderland had emerged because half the planet had been covered with ice previously. And as I said, it had been hard going, but now that the ice had melted, these huge river systems did their job. These huge river systems in China, such as the Yangtze, the Indus in India, the Tigris Euphrates in the Middle East, the Amazon, South America. All these river systems provided the means to start the agricultural revolution because the river deltas were immensely fertile. They dumped millions and millions of tons of sediments. And in those sediments, in those fertile river deltas, plants had sprung up, plants that had been scattered previously, but suddenly they became there in vast numbers for the taking, but also for their further development. And early humans realised this around 10,000, 12,000 years ago and began in earnest to start to cultivate those plants, to pick the most prolific ones, the fattest, the ones that were least likely to shed their seeds all over the place. They learned how to plant them. Remember, there was no rule book, all by trial and error. But they did it fairly quickly. They learnt which were the best species to cultivate, how to cultivate them, when to plant them. They'd already begun to learn about the seasons and the stars, and they understood the importance gradually of planting those seeds, those plants in spring, after the rains. And so, or before the rains, so that the rains could nurture them through. So basically they began to understand the very beginnings of agriculture. And they settled. and they settled in those vast river plains, those vast river deltas. And now when they cultivated their plants, they had time on their hands. They actually had time to think. And that sounds sort of incidental, but it's not, because civilization can only advance when people have to stop, are able to stop their day-to-day work and begin to use their imagination and their cognitive skills, and to be able to fashion crafts and paint and develop new concepts. So this is what happened, and this is the first, again, the Great Revolution was started by these crops becoming much more available. For example, crops such as wheat, for example, in the Middle East, and lentils and chickpeas and so forth, and even olives, rice in China, and all the other founder crops such as maize and millet and rye. Rye, I think, was started to be cultivated around about 13,000 years ago. So these basic crops were able to be cultivated, and they nurtured the early humans through. They still hunted. They still went out in the plains and obtained their meat, etc. But they had these early cereal crops, these so-called founder crops, to cover them when times when less were less easy. So the very interesting thing here, viewers, is that we begin to see a pattern emerging. We begin to see the beginnings of civilization in all its forms, triggered by the agricultural revolution, if you like, the early understanding of farming. We begin to see this pattern emerging independently in all these different centres across the world. Sometimes in different cases, ideas float across on how to do things, on how to plough, for example, how to plant at the right seasons. But generally this knowledge was gained independently in each of these major centres. So it says something, it sends a signal for how evolution is driving civilization regardless of what someone discovers here. It's highly likely, if it's useful to this alternate group, that they'll discover the same thing independently sooner or later. There may be some time differences. So we really begin to see that civilization ramps up and what it means to the early humans. So viewers, now we begin to follow this evolutionary path in the genesis of civilization. A very important path emanating from farming practices. Of course, concurrently with cultivating plants, they also domesticated animals as well. Goats and sheep and pigs and horses, and eventually draft horses to pull ploughs through the soil. So animal husbandry as well as plant husbandry. But that sort of development can't proceed unless you keep track of numbers, and also keep track of who owns what. In other words, you need to know how many bushels of wheat have been cultivated and who owns them. Who owns those animals down there on that pasture? How many do they own? What sort of animals do they own? In other words, there was a driver for an administrative system to develop. There was a driver for the development of numbers and the development of writing. So, logically, these things began. There was no magic in any of this. There were no, by the way, viewers, no earlier civilizations that did magic things, because they wouldn't have had time to develop this logical process. So the first things that were developed were clay tokens, which represented items of plant quantity or animal quantity. Little tokens that represented a bushel of wheat, little tokens that represented an animal in the shape of a cylinder or in the shape of a triangle for the grains. And these were strung together on strings, and these developed, by the way, around about 8,000 years ago, not too long after the beginning of the agricultural revolution. That was the first stage, so they could keep track of the number of items that they had developed, that they had husbanded or grown. So the next stage, however, was a big cognitive leap. That was a big abstraction process, taking those individual shapes of objects in clay, putting them into an envelope initially, but then just discarding the individual tokens and representing them by pictographs, by shapes, by abstract shapes on a clay tablet drawn with a stylus. So if you own 3 bushels of wheat, there were initially three symbols shown, 3 triangles, or 10 cattle, whatever. But eventually, then around about 5,000 years ago, there were lots of more complex tokens emerged, and suddenly it was understood that you could do away with individual pictographs and represent them instead by one entity, one number. So in other words, the little symbol for a bushel of wheat became a 1. And if you wanted to represent a larger number, you represented it by an oval shape or a round shape. So you could represent the number 23, for example, stood for 2 individual units plus 3 larger units representing tens. So that's how numbers develop, basically, by need alone and by innovation of humans. Again, their brains were the same as ours in cognitive ability, but they'd passed through an extremely important threshold, this threshold of abstraction. And this continued because you needed to know who owned these goods. And again, the goods were proliferating. It wasn't just animals and plants, it was crafts developing, pots were being developed, decorations were being developed, little sculptures, whatever. The beginnings of civilization, because people had spare time. They were also incidentally developing their first proto-villages. They were building huts, they were building them out of mud, straw, eventually out of stone. But either way, they had to keep administrative records and know who owned what, so that if someone's name, and again language had been around for a long time, probably the first proto-language around about 100,000 years ago, developing into that was probably the mother tongue one that was very basic, representing body parts or relationships with others. But the proto-languages developed probably around about 50,000 years ago, and they were Teutonic and Celtic and Baltic and Slavic. And out of that, as humans moved across the planet, if they were separated by a couple of 100 years, one group from another, you'd get a different dialect. If they were separated by 1,500 years, you'd get a completely different language. So these proto-languages developed. So they were able to talk to each other. And the sounds in those languages, if they were close to the Sumerian number sound, for example, if there was a name that was similar to oil, then they'd use the oil symbol, which was an oval with a stroke through it, to represent that name or that part of the name. So they developed a number of symbols, phonetic symbols, to represent the phonetic sounds. So language developed, and of course the first running writing was Sumerian, and that developed around about 2,600 years ago. So we see that not only were numbers developed to keep track, but also writing in the form of pictographs, in the form of symbols to start with, and then running writing developed after that. And again, these systems developed independently, in many cases, across the planet. Because, for example, in the Indus Valley, India developed its own number and writing systems. So did the Maya in Central America. All of them developed these combinations of pictograms and symbols and phonetic symbols to represent it in writing. So we see that all these systems started to develop, and they developed very quickly because they developed from around about 8,000 years ago with the earliest tokens, and they were pretty consistently developed by around about 5,000 years ago. So viewers, now we see the pattern of civilization beginning to emerge quite clearly. The driver being early agriculture, understanding of farming practices, developing into a need to develop better practices and administrative practices at the same time, forcing the development of numbers and writing systems to maintain that administrative system. And the next step concurrently is the development of crafts, the fashioning of tools, more effective tools and ornaments, and at the same time an understanding of metals emerged. The ability to smelt copper, gold, silver, copper, and eventually bronze, copper and tin, because tools needed to be stronger, ploughs needed to be tougher, weapons needed to be stronger, because at the same time as these communities were developing, these early proto-villages right across Eurasia, Asia and Europe at the same time, virtually blanketing Europe and Asia by 5,000 years ago, there was a need to protect those resources, those assets, those agrarian assets. So we see from this process a gradual stratification of society as well. People who are good at crafts, people who are good at defence. Of course, some of them were multi-skilled and had multiple occupations. When a farmer wasn't, or when a soldier wasn't defending his village, he was out farming. Same with the craftsman, but eventually this stratification developed. The workers, the labourers, the farmers, the craftspeople, the soldiers. Also there's a need to manage more complex farming practices such as irrigation. Who would be allocated which pastures? So you see another level of bureaucracy, a bureaucracy in fact beginning in these early societies. And again, that stratification of who would manage that developed right up the chain. So you get, at this stage, religion had started to develop, early Aboriginal religions, and of course there were clerics and there were priests, and they often were in the position to be in the top administrative jobs because they also were the ones who were tutored in writing and eventually reading as well. So the stratification continued, as did the development of these proto-villages. Initially there were a few extended families, which, even though some early ones actually were multiple units of extended families. One in Chile, I think, had around about 2,000 members. But basically small cohesive groups bound by culture, common culture, language, but then developing into these farming villages which might occupy a few acres, but then extending larger and larger till you get the beginning of cities. Cities with 50,000 inhabitants. Cities in which roads were laid out in a grid type structure with fortifications. Cities extending to the distance a farmer could walk to these fields and back in a day. So all these things came together with a bit of a rush, because again by about 5,000 years ago, from just 10, 11,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherers came home and started sowing the seeds, in that brief space of time, a blink of an eye in cosmic time, major developments in civilization had begun. The development of cities, 50,000 inhabitants occupying 200, 250 acres, had developed from these early proto-villages. All the artefacts of being able to write things down, numbers, early mathematics had developed. An understanding of wheels and pulleys so that structures like the Great Pyramids could be built, not by magic alone. Wheels, pulleys, fulcrums, early mathematics again enabled these early civilizations to develop these massive structures, often with religious connotations. And they developed, all these things concurrently developed across all the major civilizations, again with small time differences, but broadly the same process, which proves the whole point that all civilizations develop logically along this evolutionary path. And so viewers, the stage had been set for the next great leap in civilization, in the process of civilization. Proto-civilizations had been established by now, not just in Western Europe and the Middle East, but across Russia. And in the New World, in the Americas, the Mayan civilization, the Andean Inca civilizations, at an equivalent level of sophistication. Changes were rapidly occurring. New political and religious authorities and structures had been established. increasing urbanisation, mass production of goods and services. And so this relentless process continued in our history. Development of villages to towns to cities, from cities now to city-states, from city-states to nations, and from nations to empires. And this is the topic that we'll cover in our next program in this series: the rise and fall of empires. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.